Every family has one. The one who gets blamed when the milk goes sour, when the mood turns cold, when nobody quite remembers who started the fight. You've been that person more times than you can count, and somewhere along the way, you started to wonder if maybe they were right about you. Here's the strange part, though. The blame never lands anywhere else. Not on the parent who raised the tension in the room, not on the sibling who lit the match. It circles back to you every time, as if the ending had already been written before the argument even began. Family therapists have a name for this. They call it the identified patient, or more plainly, the scapegoat role. Nobody applies for it. It just gets handed to someone, usually early, usually quietly, and it tends to stick. Every family under enough pressure needs somewhere to put its pain. Some share that weight. Others give it, in full, to one person. It's rarely about who's actually guiltier. It's about who's easiest to point at when nobody wants to look at the whole picture. So the real question isn't, why do they keep blaming me? It's this. What happens to a mind that spends years absorbing a problem it didn't create? That question is old, older than family therapy, older than the term itself. And some of the sharpest answers to it came from men who had far more reason than most to distrust the people standing closest to them. Men who wrote about power and blame long before anyone thought to study it in a family living room. Watch how the story never really changes. Whatever actually happens in the room, the ending's already written before the scene starts. Someone raises their voice, and within minutes, the attention drifts toward whoever's used to catching it. Not because the facts point that way, because the part's already been cast. Rulers figured this out long before families did. Niccolo Machiavelli, in The Prince, wrote about how a ruler could let cruelty be carried out by someone else entirely, then step back and let that person absorb the hatred once people got angry enough. I quote, "If any cruelty had been practiced, it had not originated with him, but in the natural sternness of the minister." End quote. He wasn't handing that down as advice to live by. He was documenting, with almost clinical precision, how power keeps itself clean by pointing at someone smaller. The prince stays untouched. Someone else takes the anger meant for him. Inside a family, the mechanics are eerily similar. One person holds the blame, and everybody else gets to skip the discomfort of holding it themselves. There's a man worth mentioning here who had none of the protections we take for granted. Epictetus was born into slavery in what's now central Turkey. He owned nothing, not even the right to an explanation for his own suffering. If his master decided to blame him for something, there was no court to appeal to, no family meeting, no argument he was allowed to win. And still, he didn't build a philosophy out of resentment. He built it around a single distinction, one that's held up for 2,000 years, the gap between what other people assign to you and what you actually are. I quote, "It is the act of an ill-instructed man to blame others for his own bad condition. It is the act of one who has begun to be instructed to lay the blame on himself, and of one whose instruction is completed, neither to blame another nor himself." End quote. Read that last line again. Neither blame another nor himself. He wasn't telling the scapegoat to accept the label. He was asking for something much harder. Stop treating blame as proof. A family deciding you're the problem doesn't make it true. It only tells you where that family has decided its discomfort should live. The Stoics had a word for what Epictetus was pointing at. Apatheia. Not apathy, not numbness. It means freedom from being ruled by a judgment you never actually agreed to. A scapegoat role survives only as long as the target keeps arguing the verdict. Every "that's not fair," every attempt to prove your innocence feeds the exact dynamic that put you there. That's not because your case is weak. It's because the family system was never built to weigh evidence in the first place. It was built to have somewhere to set its weight down. Apatheia doesn't ask you to stop caring about the relationship. It asks you to stop outsourcing your sense of reality to people who've already decided the ending. You can love your family and still refuse to let their verdict be the last word on who you are. Those two things sit fine together. In many cases, holding both is the only way to survive a role you never agreed to. A person practicing apatheia isn't checked out either. They're simply no longer available to be dragged into their own trial. And this isn't only philosophy talking. Hannah Zagefka, a professor of social psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London, studied exactly this dynamic. Her research, published in the Family Journal, found that family dysfunction correlated strongly with a person being cast into the scapegoat role, and that carrying that role into adulthood independently predicted depressive symptoms later on. The weight was never just a feeling, it leaves a measurable mark, which is exactly why apatheia here isn't a nice-to-have. It's maintenance. You'll probably recognize this most clearly around the holidays. The group chat that goes quiet the second your name comes up. The retelling of an old argument where somehow your version never quite makes it into the story. A parent saying, "We're just worried about you," in a tone that sounds a lot more like a verdict. Or it shows up smaller than that. A sibling who gets the benefit of the doubt automatically, while you're expected to explain yourself before anyone's even asked a real question. A running joke that stopped being a joke years ago, repeated at every gathering until it hardened into an identity nobody checked with you first. None of it needs a blow-up to work. By and large, it survives on repetition, not intensity, which is exactly what makes it harder to name than an outright fight. There's rarely a single moment to point to, just a pattern you can only see clearly once you're standing outside it. No script solves this cleanly, but a few shifts tend to help. First, separate the accusation from the evidence. Before you absorb a family's verdict, it's worth asking what would actually have to be true for it to hold. Not necessarily much. Often the honest answer is surprisingly little. Second, let go of the need to win the argument. Viktor Frankl, writing from a place with far less freedom than a family dinner table, pointed out that the one thing nobody can take from you is the choice of how to respond. You may not get to decide how your family casts you. You still get to decide whether you perform the role on cue. Third, some conversations are allowed to end without a resolution. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Sometimes the most stoic move is simply declining to show up for your own trial. None of this is a strategy for beating your family at their own game, and it's definitely not permission to get as cold. It's about refusing to let someone else's unwillingness to look at their own part in this become the architect of your inner peace. And by and large, not every difficult family is doing this on purpose. Plenty inherited the pattern the same way they inherited everything else nobody handed them a choice about. Maybe the question was never why they keep blaming you. Maybe it's this: what would it actually cost you to stop needing them to see it differently? Epictetus never got an apology from the people who owned him. He built an entire philosophy without one. That might be the truer measure of freedom. Not whether the verdict ever changes, but whether you still need it to. Thank you for watching.